So the swift exchange of information is already, I think, an expression of what is typical for a bureaucratized institution, namely that there's an emphasis on efficiency of police work, much more so than, let's say, on what is the specific substance of our activities. Now, of course, under some circumstances, that may produce problems. And actually, going back at least to the 1950s, there have been such problems. For instance, there were occasions when certain Eastern European communist nations, when the police of those nations would send a communique, they would send a request to the Interpol headquarters to track down what they called an international fugitive from justice, but which the United States actually called a human rights defender, because it was an anti-communist. So see, there can be political problems, but only in, I would say, in rather rare circumstances. So under more normal conditions and more average conditions, I would say that there is indeed a common understanding. Now, on terrorism, Interpol has quite a long history, and that is probably because Interpol is, although it is international, it has 184 police of 184 nations represented presently, so it's very large, but it is still in history a predominantly European organization. And obviously in Europe there were terrorism problems at least since the 70s, and indeed Interpol has been working on terrorism since the 70s, initially in a very piecemeal fashion, focusing on certain crimes that are related to terrorism, but since 1998 Interpol focuses completely on terrorism. Now, like Mr. Serra said, that's a problem, because what if terrorism is seen as a military problem, or what is it if it is seen as a political problem, which it also is? Well, for the police, no, we don't deal with that, because Interpol is specifically prohibited from dealing with political and racial and religious matters. So the police look at terrorism purely from the viewpoint of terrorism as a crime. So whether terrorism is accompanied by political, ideological battles and so on is not relevant, as long as in whatever is referred to as terrorism, as long as there is also a criminal component in it, then that justifies police activities. And therefore also Interpol was involved with the investigations, at least in a minor way, was involved with the investigation since 9/11. Because even the way in which the problem was formulated, Interpol, which is currently actually headed by an American law enforcement official, Interpol looked at it from a criminal law enforcement point of view and looked at it from the viewpoint of an international crime. And indeed, what was the terrorist attack against the World Trade Center, for instance? Well, it was indeed already by name an attack against the World Trade Center. And you know, a lot of the victims were of various nationalities, so that made it an international crime. And obviously the fact that you blow up people, that's a crime. Whether you blow up people to save the world or whether you blow up people because you have some religious objectives is not that important. So these are some discussion points. There is an emphasis on these technological developments and on efficiency, to have a swift circulation of information. Actually, although only recently did Interpol change to an internet-based, private, encrypted information system. That actually has a lot to do with, which is a certain irony. Interpol is a very large organization, but a lot of the nations that belong to Interpol do not yet have that level of technological sophistication. So there is still some discrepancies there. But then the second strategy, besides the efficiency, is to depoliticize terrorism and to focus on terrorism as a distinctly criminal problem, which is not to say, of course, that terrorism is only a criminal problem. It is not only a criminal problem, but it is always that too. And thirdly, in terms of the national regional persistence that I talked about before, there is, of course, what you see worked out in Interpol is that there is a strong emphasis since 9/11 on, let's say, on Muslim fundamentalists. It's very problematic to even name it. Muslim fundamentalists, whatever you would want to call it, jihadist terrorism. That emphasis, I think, articulates the relative strength of certain nations on a global scale. Obviously the strength of the United States. Interpol has always been very keen to have participation from the United States. Ironically, they get very little participation from the United States because the United States police, they do it on their own. They have their own global system. The FBI, for instance, has 500 agents permanently stationed in all quarters of the world. So there is a little bit an ironic effect.
Professor Deflem, I hate to interrupt.
No, that's okay. You can interrupt.
Could you conclude?
Sure, I can do that. I wanted to give the second part of my talk on Europol. I just wanted to mention that the situation in Europol is a little different only in one particular sense. Namely, Europol is an intergovernmental organization. Europol, unlike Interpol, was set up by an international body of government, namely by the European Union. Nonetheless, I also argue that there are the same police dimensions, the same police dynamics taking place in Europol. And actually, what is important here to recognize is what Mr. Serra also hinted at before, is that there is a relative independence between these various parts of the state, like what I here refer to as a diversification of state power. States have political power, have international legal powers, have diplomatic powers, have military arms, have police powers. And these are not necessarily nicely in harmony. If you want to know more about Europol, I actually have a paper on that forthcoming in a journal, and all my work is online via my website, so you can read more about it there. Okay.
Now I would like to invite Colonel Emil Gomidov, Albay Emil Gomidov, Kyrgyzstan Police Academy.